Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the informational meeting for Tuesday, June 16th. We will call the meeting to order and start off with any city council open discussion. Councilors, open discussion. Councilor Erickson.
I'll be brief. Just a quick Spark update. Councilor Kiley and I sit on this task force. I am on the industry cluster group. We held our second weekly meeting moderated by Jody Schwan. This week, the industry was banking, development, and really just the future of what that means for Sioux Falls, how businesses have really waded through that. It will be put on the YouTube channel and available for you all to see. They're about an hour long and moderated pretty quickly to keep things moving. And so if you have feedback or things that you like from there, please let us know. But it's great information for our community, just kind of knowing where things are going. We will have another one next week that is open to anybody that would like to sign up. Another, I can't remember which cluster it is. It might be ag, or no, it's health. I'm sorry, healthcare. And then we'll have one more for that cluster. A couple of the other groups are still talking about hospitality and some of the other industries as well. We do meet every Thursday morning and just kind of have a brief. So that's it in a nutshell, but good things are happening with that. We have consulted with, through this relationship, there is going to be a media campaign coming out, really just instilling that consumer confidence and telling people, you know, if you're confident and you feel good, get out, go to a baseball game, go to your kids' events, go out for dinner, but really just showcasing that Sioux Falls really has done a good job to mitigate a lot of the COVID stuff, if you will. It's still here to stay, but we certainly want to see the economy back up and going and really take care of mental health at the same time with that component. So good things are happening. You'll see that rolling out soon. Really the campaign is kind of a get out kind of campaign. Just like I said, really instilling that consumer confidence. So if you have other questions about Spark, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, I know they'll be coming back again as we continue those conversations.
Thank you. Councilor Sale.
Yes, thank you, Councilor Selberg. It's kind of a sad news that I have to report that last night the firefighters lost one of their captains. Kendall Ward passed away from pancreatic cancer. And I will tell you that I've worked with Kendall years ago, and you can't find a better guy. He was what we want in this city and what you want as a neighbor and a firefighter. Also, I have to report the passing of a larger-than-life personality, Gloria Johnson, the spouse of a retired firefighter, Stone Johnson. She was just a larger-than-life personality. And over the weekend, the firefighters also lost the daughter of a retired deceased firefighter. Tanya Larson died of a stroke. So keep the firefighters in your thoughts as they go through this grieving process. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Councilor. Councilor Staley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to give an update to the community about this recount process. I was talking a little bit about it last week, and unfortunately my mic got turned off during the meeting. But as you may know, there was a 109 vote difference between my opponent and I on June 2nd, and that was out of almost 29,000 votes cast. So I did officially apply for a recount last Friday. And the way the process goes is that I pick a representative, my opponent picks a representative, and then Tom Greco, he picks a representative to be on the board, the recount board. And that representative picked by Tom Greco needs to be someone who is I'm comfortable with and someone who my opponent is comfortable with. I have chosen Randy Seiler as my representative, just to be very transparent here. Randy is a retired U.S. attorney. He's the head of the Democratic Party. And, you know, in our city government, we are nonpartisan. We're not supposed to be running as Republicans or Democrats. We're supposed to be serving everyone. In my 4 years on the council, I have worked to serve independents, Democrats, Republicans. I don't care what your party is. You are a citizen of our community. Unfortunately, there's been kind of a Republican movement to take a hold of our city. and we even have council members on this sitting at this dais right now, who have used the Republican Party as a way to influence the election. It's really, it's a very sad situation. I've been criticized in a Republican blog because I chose Randy Seiler to be my attorney because he's a Democrat. Randy offered to do this for me pro bono. My opponent has 3 attorneys working for him, Republican people. I doubt that they're doing it pro bono. I don't have a lot of money. I didn't raise over $100,000. So that Randy's going to be the guy. Tom Greco is working to find a person that is going to be acceptable to myself and acceptable to my opponent. He has 10 days to get that thing finished up from last Friday. And then we'll embark on, within that time frame, we'll be embarking on this first time ever within this form of city government recount. And so hoping that that's going to be a very smooth process. And for the sake of our community and our citizens, want to make sure that we vet out every vote and ensure them that this election, whoever wins, it was done with the greatest integrity. So I just wanted to share that, and thank you.
Does anybody on the phones have anything for public input, or, I'm sorry, open discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Councilor Kiley.
I would just like to make it clear to the public that it was not just Councilor Staley's mic that was shut off. There was technical difficulty, and all of us that were on the phone at the time of the meeting, we also lost that ability to respond. So it was not directed towards Councilor Staley. Unfortunately, it occurred and impacted all of us that were calling in. Regarding party affiliation, Councilor Staley has not cornered the market on working for all citizens. There's not an individual on this council that has not done the same thing. We've all done that. We've proudly done that, and we will continue to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Erickson?
Just for the sake of the process, I think that we should all be really careful and cautious not to use our official capacity while we get to sit here. The process needs to take its place. We need to not make a mockery of the process. I know Tom is of the utmost integrity, and he's doing his very best to get the process going. While it's important for this to have the public component involved, any media involved when that recount process does take place, I just would caution anyone on the council to continue to use their seat to try to sway one way or another. I think it's a very slippery slope. I think it's a dangerous place to be in, and I think it's an uncomfortable place as well as we wade through the process. So my hope is that this is done in the utmost of transparency, that it is done quickly, but as efficient as possible. And when I say quickly, it's not just run them through. It's a matter of let the process work, let the experts do what they need to do. If there's 2 people that are questioning that, they are there along the sides, and they have that right to be there. And so my hope is that Tom has the tools that he needs to continue this process that he's been tasked with. And I'm appreciative of him to take this challenge on, because I know he'll do a fabulous job. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Staley?
And just to follow up with Councilor Erickson, that when it comes to using our title to endorse people or have fundraisers and using our council title in ways that will influence anything, that was brought before the Ethics Board and by Councilor Janet Brecky, and the Ethics Board, because Janet Brecky had concerns about things that people on this dais had already done, and it was determined that that was, by the Ethics Board, that was our freedom of speech, freedom to do that. So I'm just giving it, we had a discussion about this last week, and wanted to bring this back up to clarify, and I will continue to give updates. And as far as the time frame goes, I am here this week, and I will be able to attend one more meeting if I would come out on the short end of this. We have one more meeting where we'll have the canvass of the votes, and then my opponent would be sworn in at the next meeting. So just so people know how that's going to play out. Thank
And
you.
I'm going to be extremely blunt and bold, Counselor. My point of my things were not that anyone could or couldn't be in an ad, as you did the exact same thing. My point is you sit and use this microphone for personal gain, which others are not afforded to. That is my caution, and I would caution anyone, regardless of what place they're in, to be using their hot mic for that. And that's my whole point for that. Just want to make it very clear.
Whoa. Chairman, can we have some order here? I mean, this has become a debate. This is not council discussion.
I will
Let's
call
just
on you,
move on.
Counselor. All right, did you have anything to say officially? Then go ahead.
I did have something to say. I was just going to say, in addition to Councilor Kiley, that it turned out that as when those mics were off, that our votes were not counted, and that those of us we were trying to vote, we thought we were voting, and we were marked as being absent and not voting, and that's going to be corrected tonight in a motion to amend the minutes. So I wanted to notify everyone of that will be coming up tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? All right, let's move on to the presentations for today. Our first one is on the Triage Center. Welcome back, Alicia.
Thank you, Counselor. Alicia Clora, City Health Department. I am here to continue our conversation regarding the Triage Center. Thank you to the project team members that are in the audience today, but especially Danny Brown, who's really been the one to lift the weight on crafting the lease agreement, which I'm here to speak about today. So last week, I came to you and we talked about a project update. I introduced Steve Lindquist as the project director, and we also talked about the joint participation agreement. This week, we're going to visit about the lease agreement and some other points of interest. Just as far as a project update, we were able to start meetings last week to begin the architectural design process, so we're anxious to possibly see some concepts before the end of the month. And then city staff are moving from the city annex to the city center as we speak over the next couple of weeks. So the lease agreement is an agreement between the City of Sioux Falls and the Sioux Empire Triage Center nonprofit. This is located at 132 North Dakota Avenue, a great location I can attest to. The health department was in that building for several years. And it's centrally located. It's within walkable distance to other services such as Minnehaha County and Falls Community Health. It's also within 1 block of a transit stop, which helps reduce transportation barriers for potential patients. Now the center is, the design will be the main floor or 1 level of the Triage Center. However, the lease does include the full building. Many reasons, we may be growing in future years, or I think the short-term intention would be that we, would love to see partner agencies have outreach, maybe social workers, maybe case managers, other staff that they may want to share space with us so that they can meet the client's needs right directly at that time. The term of the lease will be from the time it's executed until 12/31 of 2023, which is the initial 3-year project period for the Sioux Empire Triage Center. I shared this with you last week, but once again, the in-kind lease, through an informal evaluation looking at comparable space in the downtown area, was set at $173,000. This will be applied as an in-kind credit of the city's contribution to the Triage Center. And then there will be an additional $257,000 a year in cash contribution to the Triage Center for operations. We do have included in this agreement several protections of city interest. First of all, any improvements, maintenance, utilities, those will be the responsibility of the tenant. The city can come to separate agreements for those items with the tenant, but they are listed as the tenant responsibility. We are also asking the tenant for a security plan and to submit that security plan before the Triage Center opens, and the city will be able to approve that plan. We've also included provisions around tobacco control and just assuring that the tenant will abide by city ordinances for tobacco control. And finally, of course, as always, the city attorneys and risk management teams working together to make sure that we have the appropriate liability insurances, indemnifications, and all of that language in place. So for next steps, I apologize, but my slide is not up to date any longer. Tonight, I will be bringing the joint participation agreement to first reading, just as we talked about last week. The lease agreement, I am going to ask to withdraw that item. There's no concern, there's no issue, but through the process of continuing to meet and discuss and think about how this lease agreement would potentially impact a vendor, there's language in the insurance that we need to look at, because the vendor, of course, will also have their own insurance provisions that they'll need to provide. So instead of having you approve through first and second reading a lease agreement that I think will need to have a couple of maybe 1 or 2 tweaks, I'm going to ask that we withdraw that item, and I will reschedule it for July 7th and July 14th so that I can bring you a lease agreement in its final form. So I am happy to take questions on either of the items that we talked about this week or last week.
All right, councilors, any questions today? Yeah, Councilor Starr.
Thank you, Alicia. So the lease agreement is between the City of Sioux Falls and Sioux Empire Triage Center. Remind us who the Sioux Empire Triage Center is.
Sure, that is the Sioux Empire Triage Center nonprofit. SCTC is the formal name of the board between Avera, Sanford, the City of Sioux Falls, and Minnehaha County. And that joint participation agreement outlining that is what is on the agenda tonight.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet.
Anybody else with questions? Anybody on the phones? All right, you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Next up, public parking update. Director Pritchett is here. There he is. Hello there.
Good afternoon, Council. So at our presentation of the monthly financials back in May, one of the comments that was made and request that was made is to come back and do an update on the public parking fund. In large part, I think, to a couple of circumstances. One, back in November, this council had approved an additional $1.5 million for the completion of the Village on the River parking ramp. And we had kind of gone through an update on our projections for that fund at that time. Obviously, since then, with March, with the onset of the COVID pandemic, that had some additional implications to our parking fund, and so this gives us an opportunity to bring you up to speed with where we are at with that fund. So with that, I'm going to kind of jump in here. Again, as you're aware, the parking fund is an enterprise fund, and so it is self-funded. It does not receive taxpayer allocation of sales taxes or anything. It's fully supported by the people that utilize the parking infrastructure, the parking ramps and lots downtown. There are essentially 3 primary areas from which the parking fund derives its revenues. Those being primarily the first one, parking leases. So these are leases to businesses and consumers and people that live downtown. All these leases are generally month to month. And so, as you can see, as people adapted to some of the changes that occurred relative to the pandemic, they did have the opportunity to adjust their leases if they so choose. We did find that many did not, in many ways because they didn't want to lose their spots necessarily in some of the ramps. But we did see impacts there, meter revenue, and then the other piece is enforcement or patrol. Again, we saw impacts in all 3 of those areas, and that's not surprising. Like most businesses during the pandemic, there were impacts they experienced, revenue reductions, and the parking fund was no different. When you think about the fact that the parking primarily serves the infrastructure of downtown Sioux Falls, in terms of consumers, that serves a large retail, restaurant, and bar segment for our community. All of those sectors were disproportionately impacted as a result of the pandemic. In addition to, we serve a lot of office customers, and with the changes in social distancing, many of them were working from home. And so we did see some reduction in leases as a result of that. The highest impact that we experienced was started in March, but it was particular to April, and we are seeing recovery in May and June. The one thing I will say, and I'm going to walk through a cash flow here, but I will kind of get to the end and then kind of work our way toward that, is that the financial model for the parking fund is still solid, even though we've had some hits here over the last several months. But I'm going to walk through that in a little bit more detail and talk about each of the revenue sides and what we've seen, what we were projecting, and kind of where we sit today. The other thing I would say is one of the things that we did do is we set aside several meters, replaced them with signage to allow for more accessibility to our restaurants and that were serving customers with carryout downtown when they were no longer able to have customers inside of their establishments to sit or eat in. So that is something that does continue, and we'll continue to reassess the further need for that, but that is something that we continue to do. A minor loss of revenue related to that, but nothing that would be sufficient or material. The first thing I'll talk about is the meters or the enforcement revenue. So as far as how much meters, so these would be the parking meters you see along the streets. There are a few in some of the parking lots as well. They represent about 19% of our total budget for the parking. The patrol or the enforcement piece, that also is about the same amount. It's about 18 to 19% of our budgeted revenues. And we did see reductions in that. What we are currently projecting for the model right now is that they would achieve about 60% of their budgeted revenues for the year for each of those two items. And I'm going to talk about the meter here a little bit more in depth on the next slide. But we did see in April a drop to about 15% of our normalized meter revenue in that month. We have seen that starting to return. We don't have the June numbers yet and won't for a little bit, but we'll be bringing forward the May numbers here next week when we do the May monthly financial presentation. But we are seeing, we can kind of keep track of what's happening with the meters just based on our software, not necessarily in our financials yet. We are seeing that returning to about 75% of normalized activity in terms of our meters, and I think you can all kind of see that happening downtown as people start to return and take advantage of being customers for our local establishments there. This chart, what it essentially shows is if you look at the green line here, this was the revenue we had on a monthly basis for 2019. As you can see, historically, we have ranged in that $50,000 to $60,000 a month range for meter revenue. What you see in the blue are our actual revenues, so you can see them updated through May. And the gray line, that is what we projected once the onset of the pandemic occurred. So we were starting to look at this model right away in April. So that was our April projections, which we have modified a little bit some here over the last week as well because of what we're seeing relative to the revenue. So you can see we were essentially stress testing the model down to about $10,000 of revenue in the months of April through September. And you can see the actuals, we are exceeding that very slightly with some positive evidence coming back from the software in terms of what the utilization is now. We expect that to continue to improve. So we have adjusted the model for the cash flow that I'll show you here toward the end to be more in the 20,000 range for the next several months. But if we continue to see improvements, our expectation is that will continue to get better or over our projections. We do anticipate more normalized revenues in the November to December timeframe. So we are trying to take a conservative standpoint as part of our cash flow there. The other piece of it is our parking leases. Now this comprises about a little over 60% of our budgeted revenues for the parking fund. With that, we saw about a 10% reduction in our leases since probably the worst periods of the pandemic pieces in terms of the financial side. So we didn't see a significant reduction because, as I said before, many people were still retaining and paying their leases. We actually have seen some of this claw back. So most of that 10% was driven by the loss of a single tenant. And we have clawed back about 5% of that 10% loss to date. So we have actually seen people coming and inquiring about some additional leases. One of those happens to be the U.S. Post Office, who has engaged with us to lease the entire D2 lot, which is under the aqueduct there, the triangular lot. They have done that. And then they're also looking at some other long-term leases with us as well, so there may be more to come. We have also had some inquiries for some sizable amounts of leases from the 9th and Phillips building as well. So there is activity out there. We haven't seen a drastic reduction, but again, it has hit us a little bit on the financial side. Again, you can see in the green there, that's our actual revenues from 2019. We have typically generated about $160,000 a month in terms of our leases. The gray bar there is the actuals. So over the period of April and May, we were hovering in the $140,000 to $150,000 range. So not quite not quite a 10% reduction there. And the blue line again was our April projections, what we did back in April when we were stress testing the fund, where we were looking as low as about $128,000 for the period of April through September. We don't believe, we've actually increased that projection now, still believe it's conservative, but we're estimating about $138,000 over the course of the next 2 to 3 months, and then more normalized leases as that we get back into the later part of the year. As we have looked to adapt with the parking fund, we've had the opportunity to reduce some expenses for the fund. One of those was with the reduced activity, there was less need for staffing within the parking fund, and so we did, and there was need for staffing with Parks and Recreation because of the limitations we had on hiring. So we did reallocate 4 parking staff. They are continuing to be reallocated to Parks and Rec. So they are working out outdoors with that staff, and then their salaries along with that have moved to Parks and Rec for the interim. We will be bringing them back for the parking fund as the need necessitates right now. But that has generated probably about $20,000 a month in savings, just in salary savings as we've adjusted for that. The other thing that we've looked at is just prioritization of our maintenance needs. We have significantly invested into our parking ramps and from an R&M perspective. Over the past several years. We don't like to delay maintenance, but there are things that you have to have, and those are things that maybe are nice to have. So we have delayed some R&M in order to reduce our expenses there, and that has probably achieved about $160,000 in savings that we are annualized for the year. The other piece, and this is not necessarily COVID related, it's just part of a long-term strategy of being more efficient, is the introduction of more frictionless technology in our parking ramps. So this means removal of the gates. If you've utilized the Washington Avenue ramp, you would have seen this where they have the standing and you put in your number for your license plate, but it doesn't have the gates anymore. It allows for better ease in and out of our ramps. This has been installed into our First Avenue ramp as well, which is one of our more highly utilized ramps. And that one actually includes cameras and so forth, so it has digital reading technology for license plates. It makes it easier from both just a tracking perspective, but also from a parking patrol and enforcement side. It's also much more user-friendly because businesses or leasees are able to go in online and be able to adjust certain things easily, and of course also utilizing the mobile applications that go along with it. This is the updated cash flow model. This is similar to what we showed you back in November when we came forward with the request for the additional funds for Village on the River. And as you can see, I'm just going to focus here on 2020 forecast, or our updated forecast. So we began the year with about $4 million in cash. Much of that was still set aside as part of our cash contribution toward the construction of Village on the River. We project about $1.3 million conservatively for net operating income for this year. We do have a debt service payment of about $1.7 million for this year. And then you can see the project cash or spent committed. That's the portion of our contribution that was still remaining, that still remains toward the completion of the Village on the River. We anticipate ending the year with about $700,000 in cash. You can see that's a reduction from prior years, but if you look at our budget overall, we have about a $3 million budget, $700,000. You could think of that as a reserve. It's not that far off from what we actually have in reserve for our general fund, which is about 25%. And it's actually up. Back when we were here in November, we were projecting that to be about $400,000, so we're about $300,000 higher than we initially had brought forward. And part of that is some of the release of the contingency that came forward with the change orders that came forward for the Village on the River project, and those have already been brought forward in this year as opposed to in 2021. In the forward-looking years, we're looking at about a break-even in terms of operations for coverage of the debt service as well. You do see that debt service was structured in a way that we actually have a reduced debt service payment by about $200,000 less next year, and then over the course of the next several years, it does go up just slightly. We have about 12 years left on that loan, so it'll be fully paid off by 2032. We do also expect, you'll see under project cash spent or committed, we see about $200,000 coming back into the fund, and that is an expectation that when we close out the Village on the River, we'll probably have the CMAR contingency released, and we have an expectation there'll still be at least $200,000 coming back into the fund as a result. That would be after fully completion and fully paying out and closing out entirely the Village on the River project. So overall, kind of the same overall principles here as what we talked about in November. We don't expect any major changes of our enterprise model. It's still in a solid position. We expect incremental build of additional consumer demand, but we don't necessarily factor that into our financial model. We expect to not do any additional parking citation or meter rate increases in 2021. I think there had been some expectations that we would raise meter revenues or meter rates in that year, but we're not looking to do that at this time, and that's not contemplated as part of the cash flow that is being shown to you today. The last thing I'll speak to you is just a brief update in regard to the Village on the River ramp. It is nearing completion and with just minor details essentially left to complete. Later this month, we expect Mall Avenue to reopen. That would be the small roadway that is just adjacent and north of the parking ramp and to the west of the parking ramp, so that will be reopening. In mid-July, we expect the elevator install to be complete. We will do the final punch list items and the final cleaning of the facility before we take full occupancy and ownership of the parking ramp in mid to late July. And then in August 1st, we expect that we'll transfer about 300 leased customers relocating into that ramp, a lot of those coming from First Avenue or Block 11 ramps, which have the higher, typically the higher demand for that as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we will see debt service go down by approximately $200,000 in 2021, and we have a very short amortization of that loan we have for Village on the River. It should be paid off by 2032 or in just 12 years. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Director. Councilor Erickson.
Couple questions for you. Talk to me a little bit about the takeout meters, because I know that was kind of a new concept downtown where those meters were bagged, essentially bagged, and now there's some new signs up that say 20-minute parking or whatever. Is that something that's going to be permanent, or what do you foresee with that?
I don't foresee that it's probably going to be permanent. One of the things we just talked about recently is the fact that there are limitations now. As things have gotten busy, it is harder to find parking along Phillips Avenue now. And so we don't want, that was done as kind of a temporary thing to help those businesses that were struggling during this time period. But I foresee that we would probably return them at some point in the near future to being metered parking again.
Because it was super convenient. I mean, I was doing takeout downtown all the time, and I just would pull right in, off I go, and now I'm like, oh, I need a parking spot because those are open. So I get that it is busier now as we move forward. The other question I have is, there was a really big push and a drive for electronic meters and really the innovation and downloading the app. Where are we with that? Is it still being marketed, or is it just kind of just business as usual?
I might defer to our public parking manager if he has any data in terms of actual utilization for the mobile devices.
I'm just curious as if it's, I mean, I love it when I go to the cities. It's really, really convenient. I didn't know how it's been perceived here, if it's doing what we had hoped, or if there's other innovative things.
Matt Nelson, Public Parking Facilities Manager. It has met our expectations. So the utilization is approximately 5% on that, which is pretty consistent with what you usually see nationwide on the apps. What's tough with it is you go to a meter and you've got a choice to throw your credit card in there or download an app. So if you're new to Sioux Falls, it is a lot easier to stick your credit card in and use it. That being said, it serves people that are down here frequently very well. In the bigger picture, it's also used in soon to be 3 of our ramps. It's in 2 of our ramps now. So for those hourly customers that may park there overnight, they live downtown, it's a great amenity for them. And that's where we're seeing higher utilization rates actually in our ramps than at our meters. So we're hitting approximately 10 to 15% usage there. So it's a little better. But you're also seeing, like a meter, we may have 50% cash, 50% credit cards. In a facility that's off street, we'll see 90% credit cards and 10% cash. So, the customers are different and they spend differently. But like I said, it's free for the customers to use. There's no user fees on this system. So all those costs are built into our management fees with that company. So it's a great deal for our citizens.
Perfect. Thanks for the update.
Other questions? Counselor Starr?
Yes. Director Pritchett, of the 300, sorry, I was jumping to different things. I apologize, my thought process went. Of the 300 plus lease customers that are relocating, how many are net new customers to the ramp or to the system?
So I think most of them are going to be not net new yet. We do have expectations that that demand will continue to grow. For example, Block 11 has tended to be one that has been overfilled or has had more demand. I think our occupancy is something like 105%. And so that will give us a capacity to look at some of those that have been on the waiting list, particularly for that one. But initially it'll be, I believe, some reshuffling and then expansion from there in open capacity.
As we open up the new ramp, the area to the south that's gravel and the blank wall or the concrete wall, do we foresee making that some kind of temporary park or grass, or do we intend on just leaving it gravel and going from there?
For right now, it's being left alone in order to facilitate potential redevelopment. We didn't want to expend an extreme amount of money, or if it was something that wasn't going to be long-term to that facility. We also wanted to minimize the cost it was going to take to complete the facility, which was to just essentially protect the asset itself. So it's a very attractive parking ramp from three sides and maybe less attractive from one side, but it also isn't a great opportunity to be developed and be shovel-ready for that.
Would you, if we decided to make it grass or something to make it more attractive, would that be an enterprise expense, or could we see that as a park expense or some other area in the budget that we could invest in that land with outside of the public parking fund or the public parking enterprise fund?
That might be an arm wrestling match between Parks and myself over who would pay for the cost of that. Since it's not Parks land, they may take issue with the fact that it is our property. So, but it's something that we can take a look at once we get the project closed out. We know what the finalized costs are going to be. We don't expect any major change orders any longer than what you've seen. You will see some minor change orders. I think there's one for about $20,000 that's being put together, but these are just minor close-up items that are typical for the project. But I think we need to complete what we need to complete first and then reassess, just based on the development potential and what funding is available to utilize.
Do you anticipate any time in the near future that we would start an RFP process for further development for the ramp? Where do you see us going forward from this point? Because that's what I hear from citizens. How long are you going to leave it look like a big pile of concrete, which is probably the nicest way I've heard it explained. Where do you see the next steps for us as a city as we move forward to develop that property or to further develop that property?
Well, it'll be determined by just really the basis of our relationship with the prior development, and that will have to be completed first before we move forward with anything further.
Do we have an update of where we're at with that process that we can tell citizens?
I would defer that to legal.
Thanks.
Councilor Staley.
So you might have just answered this, Sean, but do you foresee any more funds that would be needed before this is going to open?
For the parking ramp?
Yes.
To complete the ramp? No. I mean, we have very minor change orders that are remaining, but it is essentially in many respects complete. If you look at the ramp, you can see that most of the work is done. We're waiting for what's left is very minor. The most significant thing is just the completion and installation of the elevator.
And then when I'm looking at the debt service, because in my mind, I was thinking that this ramp, in the past, you said it was going to be like 800,000 debt service, the bond payment. So when we see the 1.7 million, is that debt service just for the ramp, or are we talking about some other things involved?
That is strictly for the ramp, so I guess I don't have the recollection of the 800,000, but this is the prescribed debt service, and it has been ever since the bonds were
okay,
funded.
because I thought maybe it was back when I was asking, and it might have been before you came, but I thought I didn't think it was ever going to be a $1 million payment, but it looks like it has been. And then Councilor Starr was just talking about that, but if this would develop into, if it comes to fruition that we get some kind of a development thing happening, then does that take the parking aspect out of commission for a while as that's being worked on, built?
That would be a hypothetical. It's hard to determine based on, it would depend on what type of development is done at the time. But I believe in great respect, it would still maintain utilization during part of that period. I don't know if you have any.
Let's say that it came, let's say that miraculously what we had planned would happen, that I would think that they'd have to, as they're working on the outside of that thing, our parking occupancy would have to be halted for a while.
Well, certainly on the top level, you would probably likely not be parking cars right below where you're going to have construction going on. But given the high number of, I think it's what, 700 spaces in this parking ramp, 600?
There's 525.
525.
And ways there are construction techniques to work around that. So I think we'd have to defer to like a journey group or something like that. When they get that point, and ready to have that discussion, because there were going to be cars in that facility while construction was being completed on the private development prior.
I'm going to repeat that just so it's in the microphone, but essentially what Matt had stated is that there had always been anticipated that there would be some partial occupancy of that ramp during the construction of the second phase of Village on the River when they'd be constructing the upper portion of the private development. So they did anticipate there would actually be partial occupancy during that, so there's probably an expectation that that would continue. But we're looking at about 300 leases moving into it right away and over 500 spaces available as well.
So there'll be 200 extra spaces.
Potentially, but that would be available for your hourly customers that would be coming downtown as well.
And then when we look at your graph that you had the dip down of revenue generated, it sounds to me like you're giving us a great assurance that that second penny will not ever be used and needed in the midst of paying back this ramp. Is that accurate to say?
Based on the
Like
projections that we're able
guarantee.
to, based on where we currently sit today, it's in a solid position. There's not that expectation. But you can never say never in the future that we have. So I tend not to want to go down that road. But based on where we are at, and we've dealt with some pretty significant challenges over the last 9 months, and the parking fund remains solid and stable and easily able to support its debt service payment. We'll continue to monitor it here over the next 12 to 14 months as well, as we regularly do, but paying particular attention to this particular fund.
And let me say, as I end my conversation here, that I may not be able to speak to you at this microphone again before I'm done. And Mr. Sean Pritchett, I want you to know that I've appreciated your integrity and your responsiveness, and I think that you've been a very wonderful asset to this community and to that finance department. So God bless you.
Appreciate it.
As you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anybody on the phones with anything? Looks like we're good. Thank you, sir. Any public comment on today's topics? All right, we will adjourn. See you at 7.